Before Europe conquered the world with gunpowder factories and navies, it was conquered by something far smaller: a leaf, a bean, a flower, a resin. Tea, coffee, tobacco, opium. Today we think of these as ordinary commodities, things to wake up in the morning, relax us after work, or dull physical pain. But there was a time when Europeans had never tasted tea, never sipped coffee, never smoked tobacco, and had little knowledge of opium beyond its medicinal properties. These substances would fundamentally reshape European society, alter the global economy, and ultimately provide the foundation for one of the largest narcotics enterprises in history. Ironically, the story of Britain's opium empire does not begin in China, it begins in Europe. For most of European history, there was only one truly dominant psychoactive substance: alcohol. Beer, wine, and distilled spirits were woven into nearly every aspect of daily life. They accompanied meals, celebrations, religious festivals, and commerce. In many regions, they were consumed from childhood. Part of this reliance stemmed from necessity. Fresh drinking water could be unreliable, while fermented beverages were often considered safer because the brewing process killed harmful bacteria. Over centuries, alcohol became more than just a drink. It became a defining feature of European civilization. It was the centerpiece of taverns, feasts, and political gatherings. To be intoxicated was neither unusual nor particularly controversial. Public drunkenness, while sometimes frowned upon, was largely accepted as an unavoidable consequence of everyday life. Across much of Asia, however, a very different relationship with psychoactive substances had developed. Societies in China and much of the Islamic world centered their daily rituals around tea, coffee, cannabis, and opium rather than alcohol. Alcohol itself was not unknown, but it never achieved the same cultural dominance it enjoyed in Europe. One reason suggested is that intoxication from alcohol was viewed as disruptive to social harmony. Excessive drinking could lead to belligerence, emotional outbursts, and a loss of self-control, qualities that conflict with traditions emphasizing composure, restraint, and orderly behavior. Tea offered alertness without drunkenness. Coffee stimulated conversation and concentration. Opium in its earliest form was commonly regarded as a medicinal aid in some settings, as a social lubricant that encouraged calmness rather than aggression. It helped users maintain decorum and composure, standing in stark contrast to alcohol's tendency to produce disorderly behavior. The difference between East and West was not merely about taste. It reflected two different philosophies of intoxication. Europe embraced a substance that often impaired judgment and encouraged exuberance. Much of Asia favored substances that, at least in their traditional forms, were associated with moderation, reflection, and maintaining social order. For centuries, these two worlds remained largely separate. Europe continued drinking its beer and wine. Asia continued cultivating tea, coffee, tobacco, and opium within its own cultural traditions. Neither civilization realized that these distinct drug cultures were about to collide. When they did, the consequences would extend far beyond changing people's daily habits. They would redirect global trade, fuel the rise of overseas empires, and eventually transform Britain into an architect of an international narcotics network unlike anything the world had seen before. But before Britain could sell opium to China, Europe first had to become addicted to something else. The collision between Europe and Asia was not inevitable. For centuries, the civilizations of Europe had depended on overland trade routes stretching thousands of miles across Central Asia and the Middle East. Along these routes flowed silk, porcelain, spices, precious stones, and increasingly new psychoactive substances that Europeans had never experienced before. But this trade came at a price. By the late Middle Ages, the great merchant republic of Venice had become Europe's gateway to the East, dominating Mediterranean commerce, profiting immensely from its privileged access to Asian goods. Adding to this bottleneck was the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, which controlled many of the final land routes into Europe. Every pound of pepper, every bolt of silk, and every chest of exotic goods passed through layers of intermediaries before reaching European markets. This Venetian and Ottoman stranglehold created the incentive for European powers to search for an entirely different route to Asia. Rather than paying increasingly expensive middlemen, Portugal and Spain looked to the seas. What began as a search for a cheaper trade route would become one of the greatest turning points in world history. Portuguese sailors rounded the southern tip of Africa and reached the Indian Ocean. Spanish expeditions crossed the Atlantic in search of Asia, instead encountering continents previously unknown to Europeans. Suddenly, maritime empires began replacing overland caravans. The age of exploration was not simply about discovering new lands. It was about bypassing old monopolies. As the centuries progressed, the Dutch established themselves as formidable commercial competitors, particularly in the spice trade and later in the opium trade in Bengal. Eventually, Britain entered this contest, building a commercial empire that would eclipse them all. This succession of maritime powers as the pathway through Europe gained increasingly direct access to Asian commodities. Among the countless goods arriving from Asia, none would prove more transformative than tea. The earliest reports of tea reached Europe during the 16th century. At first, it was regarded as an exotic curiosity, a luxury reserved for royalty, wealthy merchants, and the aristocracy. It was rare, expensive, and often treated more like a medicinal tonic than everyday beverage. But demand grew. As trade expanded and supply increased, tea slowly escaped the palaces of Europe's elite and entered the homes of ordinary people. The British East India Company played a central role in this transformation. Direct trade with Canton expanded during the 18th century, making tea increasingly affordable before Britain eventually shifted cultivation to India in the 19th century. By the late 1800s, tea imported from India had largely replaced Chinese tea in British markets. Tea was not alone. Coffee spread rapidly across Europe. Tobacco became fashionable. Cocoa across the Atlantic. Even opium, long known in medicinal circles, became more familiar through expanding global commerce. Together, these substances sparked a psychoactive substance revolution, a period in which entirely new stimulants, relaxants, and intoxicants entered European life on an unprecedented scale. Unlike alcohol, many of these new substances altered behavior in different ways. Tea sharpened attention. Coffee encouraged long conversations and sustained concentration. Tobacco became woven into social rituals. For the first time, Europe had access to substances that could stimulate rather than sedate, extend productivity rather than simply celebrate leisure. This explosion in consumption coincided with a remarkable period in European history. The spread of coffee and tea paralleled a wave of intellectual, scientific, and commercial innovation. The Enlightenment flourished, inventions multiplied, and Britain increasingly viewed itself as standing at the center of a rapidly changing world. Whether these substances directly caused these developments cannot be concluded, but they were deeply intertwined with Europe's growing confidence and expanding ambitions. By the 18th century, Britain's appetite for Asian goods had become insatiable. Tea had evolved from exotic luxury into a national obsession. The stronger teas cultivated in India would eventually replace beer as everyday drink for millions of Britons, often sweetened with imported sugar and consumed several times a day. Yet this found new passion carried a hidden cost. Britain eagerly consumed Chinese tea, porcelain, and silk. China, however, had little interest in British goods. Silver poured eastward to pay for these imports, creating a growing imbalance that alarmed British merchants and officials alike. If Britain wanted to sustain its new way of life, it needed to find a product that China could not refuse. That search would eventually lead not to another luxury commodity, but to opium. By the beginning of the 18th century, Britain had solved one problem only to create another. The nation's appetite for Asian goods had become almost insatiable. Tea had evolved from an aristocratic luxury into an everyday necessity. Chinese porcelain filled British homes. Silk clothed the wealthy. Every year, fleets of East Indian Company ships returned from Asia carrying cargo that British consumers eagerly purchased. But there was one glaring problem. China didn't want much in return. Unlike Europe, which craved Chinese products, the Qing Empire was largely self-sufficient, possessed a massive domestic economy, sophisticated manufacturing, and centuries of accumulated wealth. To Chinese officials, Britain offered little that could not already be produced at home. As a result, trade flowed in only one direction: silver. British merchants were forced to pay tea, silk, and porcelain almost entirely with precious metals. Every shipment leaving Canton represented another outflow of silver from Britain's economy. As tea became more popular among ordinary Britons, the problem only grew worse. Britain had discovered the drink that fueled its society. Now it needed a way to pay for it. The institution tasked with solving this problem was the British East India Company. Originally founded as a trading company, the East India Company had gradually transformed into something far more powerful. It possessed its own armies, governed vast territories, collected taxes, negotiated treaties, and exercised authority over millions of people across the Indian subcontinent. The company was no longer simply participating in global trade, it was reshaping it. The British officially began trading with China in 1699, and by 715, the East India Company had established a permanent trading factory in Guangzhou, known to Europeans as Canton. This became Britain's primary gateway into Chinese commerce for more than a century, yet the underlying imbalance remained. Tea continued flowing west, silver continued flowing east. Britain needed a commodity that China would buy in enormous quantities. The answer lay thousands of miles away, not in China, but in India. During the 18th century, Britain's influence on the Indian subcontinent expanded dramatically. Around 1758, Britain conquered Bengal and Bihar, regions that would become central to its future opium enterprise. Importantly, Britain did not introduce opium to Asia. Opium had existed for centuries. It had been cultivated, traded, and consumed throughout parts of the Middle East, India, China, long before the British arrived. Other European powers had also participated in this commerce. The Portuguese established opium production in Malwa, exporting it through the Gulf of Bombay toward East Asia, while the Dutch had previously maintained a monopoly over opium in Bengal around Hogli. Britain inherited an existing trade. Then it transformed it. Rather than treating opium as a simple another valuable commodity, the British East India Company approached it with the same logic applied to every other enterprise: maximize production, improve efficiency, and scale distribution. The fertile plains of Bengal and Bihar proved ideal for cultivation. Under British administration, opium production expanded dramatically. By the late 18th century, the East India Company was overseeing cultivation in the Bengal Presidency before selling the finished opium to private merchants, who then transported it to China and sold it through Chinese smugglers. This arrangement was remarkably convenient. The East India Company could profit from opium without directly violating Chinese law. Private merchants handled the transportation. Chinese smugglers handled the distribution. Corrupt local officials looked the other way. Everyone along the chain made money, except increasingly the Chinese state. What had once been a relatively limited medicinal and recreational substance was now becoming an industrial export. British agricultural methods, expanding cultivation, and commercial efficiency meant that large quantities and stronger Indian opium were reaching markets throughout Asia. As distribution increased, so did reports of addiction and its social consequences. Britain had finally found the commodity that could reverse the flow of silver. For the first time in decades, wealth would begin moving in the opposite direction. Tea would still sail west to Britain, but now opium would sail east to China. The two trades became inseparable. One fueled Britain's mornings, the other financed them. And over the coming decades, this commercial solution would grow into one of the largest and most profitable narcotics operations in modern history. The British East India Company had found its solution. China desperately wanted nothing that Britain produced. Britain desperately wanted everything China produced. Opium would bridge the gap. It was an elegant system, at least from Britain's perspective. Rather than shipping silver to China to purchase tea, the East India Company first shipped opium from India to China. Chinese buyers paid for the opium with silver. That same silver was then used by British merchants to purchase Chinese silk and porcelain and tea for exports back to Europe. The silver that had once flowed out of Britain was now flowing back in. The trade imbalance had been reversed, but the system depended on one crucial fact. The opium trade was illegal. Successive king emperors recognized the dangers posed by expanding opium consumption and repeatedly attempted to stop it. Imperial edicts prohibiting the drug were issued in 1729, 1799, 1814, and 1831. Yet despite these repeated bans, imports continued to grow as smugglers and corrupt officials profited from the trade. The East India Company understood that selling directly to China would provoke diplomatic conflict. Instead, it built an elaborate commercial network designed to distance itself from the final transaction. The company controlled production. Private merchants purchased the opium at auction. Independent trading vessels transported it across the Bay of Bengal into the South China Sea. Chinese smugglers handled distribution along the coast. Local officials, often bribed or complicit, allowed the shipments to pass. Every participant could claim someone else was responsible. The result was one of the most sophisticated smuggling operations the world had ever seen, and it grew with astonishing speed. By 1797, the East India Company was selling approximately 4,000 chests of opium every year. Each chest weighed roughly 77 kilograms, amounting more than 300 metric tons annually, being funneled toward the Chinese market. This was no longer a side business. It became one of the pillars of Britain's Asian empire. Opium itself was not a new discovery. For generations, it had been used throughout parts of Asia as medicine, and in some communities as social substances. Opium as originally serving as a social lubricant that helped users to remain calm and composed, contrasting with alcohol, which was more likely to produce aggressive or disorderly behavior. What had changed was not the existence of opium, it was the scale. British administration transformed opium from a regional commodity into an industrial import. Improved farming methods, centralized production in Bengal and Bihar, and efficient commercial networks dramatically increased the quantity reaching Chinese consumers. As stronger Indian opium spread throughout Asia, its more harmful effects became increasingly visible. The consequences were profound. As demand increased, more merchants entered the trade. Some American merchants joined this lucrative business, smuggling opium from Turkey into China through what would later be known as the Old China Trade Route. What had begun as Britain's answer to a trade deficit was rapidly becoming an international commercial enterprise. The Qing government watched with growing alarm. Despite repeated prohibitions, opium continued pouring into the country. China was patient zero of a drug plague, with the first-hand experience of the unprecedented scale of addiction that accompanied these expanding imports. From the perspective of Chinese officials, this was no longer merely an issue of public health. It was becoming a national crisis. Silver was once again leaving China, this time not in exchange for valuable goods like silk or porcelain, but for a narcotic that the government had repeatedly declared illegal. Entire administrative systems were being undermined by corruption. Smugglers prospered, officials accepted bribes, imperial authority weakened. Yet from Britain's perspective, the trade was extraordinarily successful. Tea continued arriving in British ports. Consumers continued drinking it every day. Profits continued growing. The East India Company had solved Britain's greatest commercial problem by creating one of the history's most profitable narcotic markets. But there was one problem the company could not solve through commerce alone. Eventually, China decided it would no longer tolerate the trade. When economic pressure failed, the conflict would become military. History has a way of simplifying itself. When most people hear the words opium wars, they imagine a conflict between Britain and China over dangerous drugs. But as we've seen, the story is far more complicated than that. It began centuries earlier, with Europe's dependence on alcohol, with the search for new trade routes around the Ottoman Empire, with the arrival of tea, coffee, tobacco, and other psychoactive substances that transferred in European society. What started as curiosity became obsession. What began as commerce became empire, and what began as trade imbalance eventually became one of the most profitable narcotics enterprises the world had ever seen. The irony is striking. During much of the 19th century, opium itself was not regarded in Britain as an extraordinary evil. It could be purchased freely through pharmacies, grocery stores, and local merchants. Children would be sent to buy opium as an ordinary household errand, and many families prepared opiate remedies for coughs, fatigue, and depression at home. Tens of thousands of people were reportedly engaged in selling opium, and only later did legislation such as the Pharmacy Act begin regulating its sale. In other words, the British Empire was exporting a substance that many Britons themselves viewed as an ordinary medicine. Habitual opium use in England was not widely believed to produce the catastrophic health effects that later became associated with narcotics, illustrating how dramatically public perception of the drug would change over time. Yet perceptions did change. As the 20th century approached, governments around the world increasingly abandoned regulation in favor of prohibition. International efforts culminated in agreements such as the Hague Convention, which sought to outlaw narcotics on a global scale. The transformation was remarkable. The same global system that had once encouraged the mass production and international distribution of opium would eventually become the foundation for international narcotics control. Perhaps that is the greatest paradox in this entire story. Britain did not invent opium. It did not discover it. It did not even introduce it to Asia. But Britain did something arguably more significant. It applied the logic of the Industrial Revolution to the drug trade. It transformed opium from a regional commodity into a global commercial enterprise, supported by modern agriculture, multinational finance, maritime logistics, and when necessary, military force. It demonstrated that an empire could use markets as effective as armies, and sometimes the two became impossible to separate. Whether one views Britain's actions as an economic pragmatism, imperial exploitation, or something in between, one conclusion is difficult to escape. The story of the opium trade is not merely the history of one drug, it is the history of globalization itself. It is the story of how commerce reshaped cultures, how consumer demand redirected empires, and how the pursuit of profit altered the destiny of entire civilizations. Long before the modern world debated the ethics of multinational corporations, pharmaceutical companies, or the global drug trade, the British Empire had already demonstrated a powerful truth. Sometimes, history's most consequential wars are not fought over territory. They were fought over markets, and few markets proved more profitable or more consequential than opium.